Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about post-1940 descendancy research. Now let's start first with the concept of descendancy research. Ancestry research is where you try to identify your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and so on back through time, always looking for kind of that pedigree view of a family. Descendancy research is where you pick a particular ancestor and identify all of their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and so on down to the current day. Now here in the United States, the U.S. Federal Census, which is the cornerstone of research that we do, is under a 72-year federal privacy law, which means that the 1940 U.S. Federal Census is the most recently available census. So we get to the 1940 census and sometimes we hit this little bit of a mental wall. It's really just a mental wall. It's not an actual brick wall that we can't do any more research after that. So today I just want to talk about briefly why we might want to do post-1940 descendancy research. Then I will walk you through some of the tools that I use on Ancestry and elsewhere to accomplish that research. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start really briefly with just the whys about why we might want to do this kind of research. If any of you have taken an AncestryDNA test, and about 1.5 million of you have, then you know that you get this list of matches, and sometimes it's difficult trying to figure out how you're connected with them, particularly for those people who don't have a family tree attached to their DNA results, for those who might have a tree but it only lists a few people, and the first 2 or 3 generations of those people are listed as private because they are living. But it is possible, if you've done some extensive descendancy research, to figure out how you're connected with those existing DNA matches. Now, I'm lucky enough to still have both of my parents with me and one of my grandparents. And because I have done extensive descendancy research, on my dad's side of the family, I've been able to figure out the connection to 225 of his DNA matches. And on my mom's side of the family, I've been able to figure out the connection to 341 of her DNA matches. So that's 566 of my DNA matches that I've been able to figure out the connection because of this concept of descendancy research. So it is very possible. And because of that large amount of descendancy research and being able to figure out those connections, I've also been able to very readily help several adoptees, individuals who are adopted out of our family at various times and places, and help them reconnect with their biological families. So lots of really great stuff happening there with DNA. Again, another DNA slant, though it is not the only reason, is to help find individuals to get DNA tested in order to prove paper trails. Now, one of the things you can do is have a very methodical testing plan. So for example, if neither of your parents are still living, you're going to want to test your siblings, and you're also going to want to test any of your parents' siblings that might still be living. That will help prove biological connections to your parents and start working on a connection to your grandparents. Then you start testing first cousins on each side of the family. That connects you to your grandparents. Then you start testing second cousins on all of those 4 branches, and that will connect you to great-grandparents and so on. But that means that you have to know who all of those second and third and fourth cousins might be so that you can invite them to be tested to help prove those connections. Now, I don't know about you. I know all of my first cousins personally. I know most of my second cousins. That's because both of my parents have maintained fairly close relationships with their first cousins, and so it is only natural that I know many of their children. But we start getting to that third cousin range, and most of us don't know a lot about those people. And so descendancy research helps us figure some of those things out. Now, there are non-DNA reasons for doing descendancy research. I started doing descendancy research, more than a decade ago because it was something that just fascinates me for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's just a matter of wanting to hold a family reunion. One of the first large-scale descendancy research projects I did was because I had published or was in the process of writing and publishing a biography about a third great-grandfather of mine who I had studied a lot about and learned a lot about his life, and there was enough to write a book, and his life was fascinating, and I wanted to make sure that everybody who descended from him knew what an amazing man he was. We also wanted to hold a family reunion in commemoration of the 200th anniversary of his birth. And so that was going to be in 2009. I started this project in about 2004. And by the time we held the reunion, we had identified about 6,700 descendants in just less than 200 years that descended from this man. Since then, with marriages and children being born and new branches of the family being discovered that we hadn't discovered at the time, we're now up to almost 9,000 descendants of this particular individual. And so we were able to hold a family reunion. We published that book, and it's also really fascinating to me to look for interesting patterns among the descendants. This particular individual, though we don't have any specific descriptions of him, and though all the photos are black and white, we strongly suspect was a redhead, just based on the little evidence that we have of that. And as we started looking throughout the family, we noticed tons of redheads. And so we actually did a little poll and realized that this particular family, these descendants of this specific individual, have redheadedness in their families at a rate more than 2 times the European average. And so that was kind of a fascinating pattern to start looking for, that somehow those genes, or the people that they're attracted to that marry into the family, all have these genes of redheadedness. And there are other patterns we've noticed as well, but it's fun to start to look for those commonalities among people who are descended from a singular ancestor. So lots of different reasons. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are the reasons that I do a lot of this. So let's talk about where to start. Of course, you first want to make sure that your own paper trail back to your target ancestor is solid. What that means is that you want to make sure that you have followed the genealogical proof standard, that you've done reasonably exhaustive searches, that you've documented your information, that you have connected the right people, that you've there's as that conflicting evidence comes up, you want to make sure you resolve it. You want to make sure you've analyzed those records correctly and recorded the correct information, and part of that means that you need to make sure that you've identified all of the children of any given couple. And I find that it's easy to do that as I go. So rather than tracing from myself in a direct line back up to a third or fourth great grandparent, as I go, I make sure to include all of the children. So I've entered my parents and all their children, and I've entered my grandparents and all their children, and my great grandparents and all of their children, and so on. And that makes it easier when it's time to turn around and come back down the tree to branch down the tree. However, it also is a really more accurate way to do that research. If you've identified all the children, you're more likely to have identified the correct parents than if you're just trying to connect a single child to their parents. Now, I've talked about this before, so briefly what that means is very often you will hit brick walls in your research, and one of the reasons that we hit those brick walls is because we don't branch out. So my grandfather's death certificate does not list the names of his parents because actually it's my great-grandfather, because the third wife never knew them. And so when she informed the information on the death certificate, she did not know who his parents were. However, the death certificates of his siblings do list the names of the parents. And so if you can connect the siblings to one another and the parents, you start to see these more complete pictures of families, but it also means you are more accurate in the information that you're adding to your tree. Another thing that you're probably going to want to do, if you're doing this for non-DNA purposes, this is particularly important. If you're doing this for DNA purposes, I understand how it's easy to get a little bit scattered. But if you're doing this for non-DNA purposes, focus on a particular line. In the case of my Samuel Mulliner project, I focused on him and his descendants solely for a long time so that I could make sure that I had identified them all. What that meant is that I was super familiar with the family and was more readily able to see patterns more readily able to make some of those connections because I was totally immersed in that particular line of research. Now, if you're doing this for DNA purposes, you need to focus, but the focus is going to be a little bit more different. It's not going to be 3 years of focus on one singular family. It could just be a single session where you're sitting down for an hour or 2 or 4, and you want to learn all you can about this individual and their children and grandchildren in that time period. So this is kind of the introductory information about why we do descendancy research, where to start doing that descendancy research, what exactly that means. So let's talk about that post-1940 wall and where we go. Now, of course, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you have all the information solid up to 1940. So from whatever ancestor down to the 1940 census, make sure you've collected all that information in all those census records, and use other records as well. However, once you get past 1940, there are various privacy laws that come into play. Now, the federal privacy law, as I mentioned, is 72 years. So the 1950 census will not become available until 2022. That means you have to start to become familiar with which birth, marriage, and death records are public for the time and place that you are researching. Some states, and I always use Oklahoma as an example. I hope Oklahoma doesn't feel bad about that because it's not the most stellar example. Oklahoma has a 100-year privacy law on their birth records, and that's not uncommon. There are several states that have similar laws, but they have a 100-year privacy law on their records, which means that no records before 1916 or after 1916 are available for the state of Oklahoma. Some states believe that birth, marriage, and death records are public record, and so you can access those records from any time. And many of those records have been placed online. So states like California, Kentucky, Texas, Indiana, you're going to see birth, marriage, and death records that come right up to the current day in many cases. Now, on Ancestry, the fastest way to discover if those records are available online is through the card catalog. If you've never used the card catalog, it is my favorite feature on our whole website. You're going to find it under the search menu on Ancestry. Click in here to the card catalog and just type in the name of the state that you are interested in. I put in California, for example, and it tells me that the online index, birth index for the state of California goes through 1995. The death index goes through 1997. The marriage index goes through 1985. That's pretty recent information. I can do that same thing with any single state in the United States, and it will tell me exactly what is available for that particular location. In the case of North Carolina, I've got death certificates through 1976. Those are actual certificates, not just an index. The birth index goes through 2000, the marriage index goes through 2004, and the death index goes all the way through 2004. So we've got some really great resources available depending on the time and place, like I mentioned, that you are interested in. So just do a search in the card catalog for the state, and it will tell you what is available. Now, I, for example, have a family in my tree, and I know that they were in California in the 1940 census. I have information about who the daughters in this family married, but what I'm looking for is the names of their children. So I can come in here to the California Birth Index, and I can type in a last name, and I can type in a mother's maiden name, and I can click search, and that will show me the 4 of their children that were born in the state of California with their birth dates and the county in which they were born. And so that gives me really excellent information about living people in records from states where those records are public record. Now, if the record is not on Ancestry, you can do a search for the State Vital Records Office. And every single State Vital Records Office website I have looked at tells me exactly what the state privacy laws are and who holds records for different periods of time. It will tell me if I can access those birth records on their website, or if I have to have somebody go into the Vital Records Office and do a search there at their facility, or it will tell me that these records are not available after a particular date for anybody who is outside of the immediate family. So it's a really easy way to just see what's available. Check the Ancestry card catalog and see if it's available online. Then check the State Vital Records website, and it will tell you what records are publicly available offline and how to access those. The other thing you need to do is think about this concept of original records. So many of the records on Ancestry, even though they go up through current times, like the California Birth Index, the state organization has not allowed us to publish a copy of the original document, the original birth, marriage, or death certificate online. So they do have a type of privacy. So the indexes are made publicly available, but the original images of the certificates might not be publicly available. But I could still probably order them. If they've made the index available online, in almost every circumstance, that means I can order a copy of the original certificate. And I need to think about what additional clues I could get if I ordered an original record. Now, when you're doing ancestry research, in my case anyway, I always order the original records. I always want the records of my parents, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents and their children, those immediate family members, because I'm trying to reconstruct those families. As you start doing descendancy research, those numbers get really big really fast, and you're usually doing it for a very specific targeted purpose. So you have to make a decision about whether those original records are going to be beneficial to your research or not. Sometimes they can be super beneficial, so you have to think about it. Next up is obituaries. Obituaries and just newspapers in general are probably the single resource that I use the most in doing descendancy research. So you have to think about, does an obituary exist for anyone in this family? And then sometimes you have to think outside of the box just a little bit. So for example, we're talking about post-1940, but if somebody in the family died in 1934 or 1936, you might still want to get a copy of their obituary because, maybe by the time the 1940 census rolled around, not all the children were still in the household. Some of those children may have gotten married and gone off, and if you don't know who those individuals married, for example, those daughters in particular, where the surname likely changed, then continuing to trace those descendants is going to get a little bit tricky. So don't just look for obituaries after 1940. Also think about the obituaries prior to 1940 that might give you the information that you need to continue to trace the children in that particular family. When I say think outside of the box, I also mean don't just think about looking for the obituaries of the parents. Look for obituaries of siblings. Sometimes the obituaries of siblings in a family will list, again, married names of sisters. Sometimes it will list spouses' names, which is an important identifying factor in making sure that you're tying the right families together. Sometimes obituaries even list nieces and nephews, grandchildren, so that's really great. Again, another think outside the box technique for obituary research is to look for the obituaries of in-laws. I have seen plenty of obituaries where in the list of survivors it lists the names of her brother-in-laws and her sisters-in-law, and so that's really important to be able to collect all the information about a family and make sure you've cobbled that family together correctly. Now, Ancestry has some obituary indexes online. Again, I'm going to use the card catalog. That's a really great resource. I can come in here and I can type in, actually I'm just going to type in obit with a wild card because that will catch obituaries. You're going to see here that we have the U.S. obituary collection that goes through it says 2015. We last updated it, as you can see here from the pop-up card, on January 20th of 2016. And basically what this is obituaries published in U.S. newspapers and funeral home websites and different places around the internet that we have compiled into a singular database that then links you out to wherever that obituary exists online. Now keep in mind that sometimes newspapers depublish information. So they may only publish an obituary in an online version of their newspaper for 2 or 3 months or for 6 or 8 months or for a year, and then sometimes they depublish those. And so those links don't always still work. but the index will give you enough information to know what newspaper it was published in originally, and then you can contact that newspaper to get a copy or see if it has been archived somewhere else online. Another great resource is the Obituary Times Daily Index from RootsWeb. This is just groups of volunteers who actually go through newspapers, print newspapers in many cases, and create an index of the names of the people who died, the date, and newspaper that it was published in. Again, it's a resource to get you to the original. And I have found sometimes just a quick call to the local library in the town where that newspaper is published oftentimes will yield a helpful librarian who will make a copy of that particular obituary. Sometimes they will email it to me at no charge. Sometimes they'll ask for $1 or $2 donation, and they'll mail me a copy or email me a copy of that particular record. Lots of other things listed here in the obituary category. As a matter of fact, there's 121 databases. These two for US-based research are the most popular. Ancestry also owns a website called newspapers.com. Newspapers.com is a huge resource for all newspapers, but particularly for obituaries as well, especially those obituaries that kind of fall into that 1940 through 1980 or 1990 category. We're talking pre-internet days, published newspapers that might not be online anywhere else. And so I use newspapers.com a ton. And we're not talking about just obituaries at this point. Once we start diving headfirst into newspapers, we are talking about engagement announcements, wedding announcements, stories that talk about the relationships in the family because the groom's brother was his best man and his sister was the maid of honor and the niece was the flower girl, and you start getting all of these family relationships in some of those marriage announcements as well. It's a really great resource. You get birth announcements, you get family members visiting other family members in small towns, and so again, out of newspapers, even 1 or 2 line clips in the society pages, among families that you might think would never make the newspaper, you're going to find resources to cobble together the information about families after 1940 in a way that you might not in any other way. It's pretty fantastic. Now, let's talk about Ancestry member trees in our last few minutes together. Public member trees are probably the place where you're going to start to see some of the most success, especially when we're talking about DNA in particular. When you do a DNA test, you can see the tree or a snippet of a tree of your match. In this case, this particular individual only has 3 people in her tree: herself, her father, who is deceased, so his name shows up, and her mother, who is, at the time she created the tree, still living, and so she is listed as private. And at first glance, this might seem almost hopeless, especially because it turns out I'm related through the mother's side of the family. But because I had done descendancy research, I recognized the name of the father, and I knew that he was married to one of my grandmother's cousins, and so I knew that this person was my father's second cousin. If I hadn't known that, however, I can pull up the information here, and it will show me that he passed away in 2011 in Washington. I can go pull a copy of his obituary. It will likely list his spouse and all of his children, and now I have a really clear understanding of how I'm related to this person, even though they only have 3 people in their family tree. Now, in some of the other trees, it gets a little bit trickier. When you have families like this, where maybe you don't recognize any of the surnames, the parents are both deceased, so you can kind of start to dig into that, but you might have to build the tree out a little bit more. And so instead of doing your own ancestry research, what you end up doing is the ancestry research of other people. Am I related to her through her mother's side of the family? Well, I might have to build the tree back a couple of generations to figure that out. And if she was living after 1940, I might have to dig into some of these post-1940 resources to make those connections. When we do our own post-1940 research, often we're talking to living people. We can talk to our parents sometimes and our grandparents to get back to that 1940 census. But when you're dealing with someone else's family, it gets a little bit trickier, and so you have to use some of these same techniques of public records, newspapers, obituaries, other information that's going to connect you to those family members. When you're using online trees, whether it's of a DNA match or not, just remember that you can also look for some patterns. Oftentimes you can see things, so like here in this particular tree, she's living, her father is living, so their information is private, but her grandparents are both deceased and her mother is deceased. So I could pull her mother's obituary from 1979, and hopefully at the time of her death, she was married to someone with the last name of Pace. If she wasn't, either he went by a different last name or she was on a second marriage at the time she died. So those are some of the tricky things we have to kind of look for in obituaries. When you start dealing with blended families, which becomes a lot more prevalent as we move into the mid to late 1900s, you have to recognize that just because an obituary states a relationship doesn't mean that's the relationship. For example, I've seen an obituary just this week where the woman listed all of her surviving children. And in fact, only 3 of those children were biologically hers. One of them was a foster child and the other 4 were stepchildren. I've seen surviving siblings listed, and it turns out that some of those siblings are biological, some of them are fully biological, some of them are half siblings, and some of them are step siblings. And so you have to keep in mind that those relationships can sometimes alter over time. You also have to remember that just because a spouse is listed does not mean that that particular spouse is the parent of all of the children listed. So lots of research has to be done. An obituary cannot stand alone as a singular source of information. You still have to do a little bit of digging into some of those other records. But having a tree, even with private information, I could pull the obituary of the parents to find the names of the children. Were any of them married to a woman with the first name of Virginia? Was Virginia's obituary, does Virginia's obituary list her as a Pace? And what is the name of her husband and the name of her children? So again, it's just a way to start to connect some of those things, but you do have to kind of beware, especially with those obituaries. The final pieces of information that I want to share with you have to do with actually contacting living people, or again, kind of making sure that you're on the right track. Obituaries, besides listing survivors, very often will list the current residence of the survivors. So I can come into the Public Records Index on Ancestry to get more specific birth dates and addresses. So I come in here to Ancestry and I can just type in public, so it helps if I spell it correctly, public records, and that will show me that Ancestry has 2 volumes of public records indexes. Both of these have close to 500,000 records a piece in them. I can come in here and I can say, well, it told me in the obituary that the surviving, 3 of the surviving sons lived in a particular town in a specific location. And so I can type in that location and mark it exact. I can type in the surname and mark it exact. And I can click search and it will show me all of the individuals by that particular name who live in that specific location. And sometimes you'll see, not in every case, but in some cases, it will give me birth dates and addresses, and occasionally you'll end up with a phone number as well. And that's a really quick, easy way to get contact information. It also helps you to put those children in a family in a given order, in a birth order, as you start to collect some of those more recent birth dates. It helps you connect the dots so that you know that the John Smith, who is listed as the descendant of this Mary Smith, who is listed as living in Pleasant Grove, Utah, is actually the right John Smith, that you're chasing down the right person. Social media can also provide you with some really great clues. I will oftentimes, again, if I've got a location and a name, do a search in Facebook. Facebook allows you in their search bar to say, I want to find people named John Smith who live in Pleasant Grove, Utah, or just who live in Utah. And it will show me a list of those people. And I can go through them one at a time and I can look at their friends lists. And oftentimes what I'm looking for is, do they have any friends who have the same first names as the other individuals listed in the obituary, or who have their mother's friends with their mother's maiden name. That could be first cousins. So you start to look for some of those things. And then, of course, if all else fails, talk to each other. Send Ancestry messages, message your DNA contacts, send messages on Facebook. Let people know that you're building a family tree and that you would like to include them, and see if they're willing to share any information with you. Now, in this world of privacy and concerns and fear, sometimes people are not willing to share that, and you have to respect that that decision is available for every person. So respect those choices that they make, but don't be afraid to ask, because I have found that some of the richest sources of information have come from the connections that I've made as I have just reached out to those cousins, asked the questions about who their parents and grandparents were to make sure that I'm in the right family. Sometimes I will even preface my message with things like, are you the granddaughter of, Norma Johnson, who married Fred Smith? And if you are, then we're related, and I'd love to share information. And sometimes that's all I share in my opening message, because if they're not part of that family, invariably they're going to tell you to go away, right? No, I'm not. Thanks for contacting me, right? But if they are part of that family, the fact that you already know information might make them feel a little bit more comfortable in just verifying that information and sharing additional information with you. Well, that is all I have prepared for you today. There are other videos on the Ancestry YouTube channel that go into some of these techniques a little bit more in detail. I've done videos on how to search the card catalog. I've done videos on how to search newspapers. I've even done a video, I believe, on the Public Records Index and manipulating some of that information. Also, we have at least one and maybe even two videos out there on obituary research. So this was just to give you a boost in the right direction as you do your post-1940 research. If you need some additional training, please check out our YouTube channel, or feel free to come over to our Facebook page and ask questions. We have a very helpful community there who is happy to assist. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.